First, let me just say welcome virtually, Yussef, to the Stuckeman School here at Penn State. Our department head, Frank Jacobus, wanted to actually sort of welcome you himself virtually, but had a kind of schedule conflict which came up. So I will sort of extend that, let's say, welcome to the school on his behalf. And for those of you who are here in the jury space and joining us online, let me just share a little bit about Yussef Agbo-Ola, who's like his hyphenation in his name. He's one of these people who, to describe him, you always need sort of a multiplicity of words. But born in rural Virginia in a multi-heritage Nigerian, African-American, and Cherokee household, Yussef Agbo-Ola's work reflects hybrid identities and relationships to different landscapes, ecologies, and cultural rituals. His British Pavilion exhibition work at the most recent Architecture Biennale shows organic cotton skins inspired by traditional architectural elements within Yoruba and Cherokee cultures. Their embroidered motifs reflecting cosmological belief systems within these cultures. Yussef is one of these people who works across sort of art and design, architecture and space making, environmental design. And in terms of degrees, I think, and you can correct me, Yussef, if I missed something here, but my understanding is that you started out in actually anthropology at Virginia Commonwealth University, and then did an MFA at Wimbledon College of Art, and then a master's in environmental architecture at the Royal College of Art in London. And since graduating, Yussef has been really hyperactive, forming a London-based studio, Alani Studio, which is a multidisciplinary design studio aiming to expand environmental awareness that works globally with artists, scientists, institutions, design students, architecture studios, and rural communities. I'm hoping that some of what Yussef will share tonight will cover some of this work, but I know that in terms of some of his recent kind of, let's say, phase of hyperactivity, has involved major exhibitions at Serpentine, at the Palais de Tokyo in Paris, as well as part of this most recent British Pavilion. So without anything more from me, I want to say, Yussef, thank you so much for joining a wormhole sort of through the internet to join us from Lagos and to share some of your process, which is the kind of work I think that many students at this school are searching for in some ways, let me say, a vocabulary, if not even necessarily a praxis. So thank you again for spending your time virtually here late at night from Lagos, and welcome to the Stuckeman School here at Penn State. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much. Yes, amazing. Thank you so much. Yeah, I'm just to prep everyone, I'm kind of like a free flow kind of energy person. So I have some projects, but I will kind of just talk through mainly like the philosophy of different things that kind of inspire me in the studio. And then from there, I'll try to touch on some key projects or some projects that are like examples of this like kind of flowing energy. And then I guess we can open it up for some questions. And yeah, so I guess I can share my screen and then just kind of jump in. Let me see. You can see my screen, right?
I think we see the other screen. You probably want to swap screens.
Swap screens. Which screen do you see? Do you see a PDF?
Oh yeah, now we see your screen. We see a PDF you just opened. Yeah.
Okay. Perfect. Okay, so cool. I will just kind of hop in. He gave a really good kind of introduction, synopsis of my different interests and things that have kind of led me, to where I am now. Yeah, I practice architecture and art, and for me, really, I think the titles of like artist and architect, I'm always like yeah, I'm not necessarily fully like embracing either one of them. It's kind of like a mixture of the two different identities, you know. I love the science and kind of like the detail and different things that goes into architectural pedagogy, as well as kind of just the cohesive nature of like understanding how things work. And on the artistic side, it's the same type of rigorousness as far as like introspection, but also just being able to freely kind of express something and also kind of aim to provoke different types of emotions and observations with art. So this is something that has really like catalyzed like my practice, you know, some like two pillars that I really stand on is art and architecture, but the blending of the two is where the beauty kind of comes in for me, rather than keeping them in two different dichotomies. So yeah, the studio is based in London, and then we also have a kind of a research, like a research kind of. Am I broken up? Can you hear me?
You're good. You're good.
Okay. We kind of have a like a research base also in the Amazon forest, based in French Guyana. So yeah, I'm in between the two locations, and yeah, I think again this dichotomy of like man-made environments like London in the city, but then a complete kind of um dynamicity and kind of like dynamic nature of the force. I also am really inspired by that and kind of need that for fuel. So I'll start by saying Ubuntu. I am because you are. 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 This is like a grounding like philosophy of just me as a person and kind of what I stand on. I'm always looking for the relationships between the outer and the inner. Like I'm always looking for like purpose, but also like I'm looking for feedback from like environmental elements, from trees, from plants, different organisms, human and non-human. I'm always kind of understanding myself and like who I am as a person through like the interaction, through like these cybernetic or even just like relationships between myself and my outward surroundings. So this really is a key kind of pillar. Other elements. I'm very interested in things, this idea called architectural depth. You know, I think like architecture sometimes like has this kind of like trajectory and this ideology that, you know, like things have to last for a really long time. You know, a cathedral or a building kind of structure has to last for 50 or 20 years, you know? And for me, I think I'm more interested in the reversing of like that process, making more so living kind of sacred structures that are allowed to, you know, erode or decay or grow. The idea of and not just within architecture, even with art. For me, again, like I just said, there's a feedback that I'm very inspired by, that I'm always looking at this feedback with natural energy systems. You know, what happens when the wind kind of like dances in one of the temples, or what happens when like the sun basically, you know, bleeds its energy into like material science, and then it transforms and it moves. And you know, I'm really interested in making things in collaboration with the natural environment, and watching that change in that feedback loop in a state of observation or even contemplation. So works being left to be destroyed, left to bloom, left to dry, left to become alive, all under the parameters of kind of natural systems. These are all inspirations. And, you know, like he said in his introduction, I started off in anthropology, studying different cultures, you know, the way that they perceive the environment, and just being kind of really much so inspired by like the human perspective in relation to environmentalism. But there was a time in my art kind of education where I was like looking at landscapes and then trying to represent them again, you know, like trying to basically um represent the energy that I was seeing, you know, almost, I mean, even to the point of like landscape painting or even conceptual kind of works that would represent what I was seeing. And then like I actually moved away from that into thinking about why not, like I mentioned before, why not instead of just trying to depict the landscape, why not create something or try and create something that has some type of feedback loop, or it's getting away from that idea of permanence, like depicting the landscape in its static form. I thought maybe I could go to something or experiment with creating things that were more ephemeral, that changed with the environment. And this concept of ephemerality and also entropy are huge kind of like, I would say, like laws, for me, that I'm very much so interested in and constantly inspired by the rate of decay and change, how when something dies or is transformed in a state of transformation or metamorphosis, it's expelling energy, at the same time. So I think being interested in death and decay, but also the ideas of rebirth, you can kind of see this energy within all of the work. And to me, that is sacred. That exchange of energy from living to dying, or from dying to living, that exchange of energy is what I deem as sacred. So ephemerality, systems, seasons, fragility, temporal time, and permanence. And this is kind of an example of that. This is like right from the terrace in the Amazon. And it's like you have this so many organisms, so many sounds, so many different smells, so many different colors in the forest. And you have all of this energy that's constantly being exchanged. Um, and like the death of a snake, for instance, in this picture is then food again for these ants. There's this constant breaking down. So this for me is like, yeah, it's amazing. It's very gorgeous. Here's another example, like rust or oxidation, again, like a metal kind of element having this like transformative quality based on like water, hydration, humidity, but also again becoming like almost the apparatus for algae to then grow. So yes, these are kind of images that depict that. So two key points as well: biophilia, yeah, the just the way that basically humans seek connections with nature and life is very much so inspiring. And then topophilia, so the effect and bond that people have when setting in space is in place is key elements, the internal and the external environment. I'll be the first to say that most of my work comes from a very personal kind of introspection that I'm doing. And I think that the internal ecology, like the mental ecology, is just as important as like outward environmental ecology. So even within myself and with the studio, like I'll be the first to say that, you know, I'm constantly learning. Like I'm constantly like reformulating, like decaying my own perspective in the way that I relate to the environment through the work and through the research. I'm constantly going back within my own mind and saying like, okay, like, why are you perceiving the environment in this way? Like what are the fundamental like aspects of change that are going on in my mind? And I think for me, the most important thing for me here is like, I don't think that you can have an outward effect on the environment unless you kind of question your own kind of anthropological perspective of what's going on in your own mental ecology, because that is also an environment, and it goes back to topophilia and anthropology, looking at different perspectives, cultural perspectives of the way you perceive the environment. So, for example, like in Yoruba, my family is Yoruba in Nigeria. There's so many different like kind of ceremonial rituals that are done, ceremonies and rituals that are done to kind of honor the environment in different ways. For instance, giving offerings to the river, she's seen as kind of a living entity. Also to mountains, or to different kind of sacred woods and things like this, or different organisms. There is there's that cultural kind of perspective within me, mixed with my Native American kind of culture also, and also the African American. So I just think this is like really important in relation to talking about environmentalism, because a lot of the times it just goes to how can we produce more energy, how can we basically harness energy from the environment, which I don't have a negative or positive kind of opinion on that. But I just feel like the conversation of environmentalism sometimes kind of overlooks the internal mental ecology and how we kind of perceive things. So four kind of key elements that I'm always trying to somehow formulate in the work is adaptability. So adaptation with form and adaptation with collaboration with natural environments, dynamism. So I'm constantly looking at how organisms make structures, how different kind of microscopic organisms also make architectures. I'm constantly looking at just the dynamism in the environment and different natural engineering processes, culture, rituals, ceremonies, different things of this nature. I'm always wanting to or aspiring to embed like different cultural, my own, and also with the permission of other cultures as well, trying to embed some of their cosmologies, some of their thoughts and ideas about the environment in the work. And then there's impact, and that's just through life and perception. So I won't go through all of these, but again, the culture, impact, questioning things, making sure like perception is always being pushed, through the work. Um, yes, human rituals, environmental rituals and actions, adaptation in the sense of having the work change and really collaborate, and then dynamism, always kind of studying other organisms and the way that they do things. And I think like the mixture of all of these four for me is like an environmental empathy. It empathy design formula. It really grounds me in the different projects. I try and make sure I check off all four of those for each project that we kind of take on when we deliver, to make sure that it's kind of throughout the whole process, it has a form of environmental empathy, inside of the work. So yeah, I'll just read random stuff from here. These are kind of all inspiration. So building narrative, music as experience, time and process, the 3D. Yes, telling stories through your own perspectives, learning through song. Yeah, what happens if you allow a new work object after you create it to then have new symbolisms, vertical connections, connections to the cosmos. Yes, what didn't I read? Sound works, ice archives, skin and dust. All of these are just inspirations. Networks, networks, anatomy, soil classifications, terminology, how we work with or how we kind of yeah, use terminology in poetics to be therapeutic, cosmology, sacred, yes, anthropological kind of healing systems. All of these kind of make up the feel within like the studio's mental ecology. So kind of just, these are just inspirations. I will quickly just talk about one word, and that is the sacred. Um, I'm still trying to figure out exactly what the sacred is on a personal level. I think that it's very beautiful, the idea of like reverencing kind of an object. And like I mentioned before, like a lot of times the reverence of an architectural object or even an artifact is kind of in the preciousness of how we can maintain it, how we can make it last for a long, long time. And I think over the years, um, for me, the sacred has become the reverse. The sacred has become um, actually the energy that or the energy that I cannot hold on to. It kind of removes my ego, let's say the architectural or even the artist ego from the picture when you create works that are meant to transform and decay. You know, the final kind of the final work I really have no control over. I'm more so watching the final work, yeah, evolve. And through that evolution and through that process of adaptation, I'm then learning, I'm learning different forms of like sacred observation through like patience and things like this, but also by creating kind of new habitats for other organisms, as well as like sacred spaces where humans also can give offerings, basically a connection place between the human and the non-human. So for me at this point, in this moment, that is what I deem as sacred. So if I say I'm creating like a sacred form of architecture, it's not necessarily connected to any type of religious um belief or the ideology of like sacred as in like a religious or spiritual practice. It's more so in like how transformation through life and death and decay becomes sacred because it kind of it trumps the ego. It allows you to kind of be humbled by the systems of nature and that or the natural systems of energy that collaborate with it. So yes, that's where I'm at with the sacred. Imagination, not imagination, as a factor of the contracted, not imagination as a factor, reality, new ways, limits of the known compartments, but to see as one does, but to see as one does, but to see as one does, but to see as one does energy and weakness, as one does water and rain, to see as one does water and rain, as one does mud and quicksand. So I'm going to talk about some works. So the material, the mineral, and the molecular. And these are kind of I'm finished with the philosophy basically, but these are kind of like elements in which different scales on which the practice is working within. And I'll try and give some examples that pollinate some of the things that I've been saying earlier. So this is the Yemonja shrine in Ibadan. And this is just an example of the spirit of water. Yemonja is the goddess of water, the goddess of oceans and all of the creatures within it. And so I would just like to give some honor to her. So this work is called Molecular Violence. It's basically it's very important that I mentioned water in the beginning of introducing this work. And that is because in Nigeria, in the Delta State, in Oguni land, there's many, many, many rivers. And if you guys don't know, Nigeria is the fifth kind of largest oil producer. And there's a lot of like molecular violence that actually happens in some of these river systems in Delta State. There's a lot of oil spills and there's a lot of kind of like contamination to the river that goes unseen. Now in Yoruba, like I mentioned, like Yemonja as well as Oshun, they're kind of entities of the water. So on one element culturally, you have like these different companies that are coming into Nigeria and basically producing oil. There's a lot of corruption kind of around it. But then like you have all of this contamination and like pollution in the water systems. But in Yoruba, like the water is a living entity. Like it's a god, it's like a living kind of spiritual entity. So on one level, you have pollution, where you can just say that it's environmental kind of contamination. But on another level, you have kind of cultural degradation based on like your belief systems and based on the entity that lives actually or resides or inhabits the water. So for me, it was very important to like do this collection of photographs that kind of catalyze like the energy of the spirit of the water, but also kind of show like the molecular violence that's happening on a totally different scale. So basically, I collected water samples and also made offerings to the river. And we looked at these different water samples under electron microscopes about, I would say, 500,000 to 1 million times what the eye can see. And so on that scale, you have all of this, let's say in one sense, it's an element of beauty. When it's shown in a museum or shown in a different gallery, people, they express, oh, wow, the photographs are beautiful, you know, but there's beauty there, but there is like this backstory that I think art has it has that characteristic of like provoking one to kind of see the other side of what's really going on, but by using beauty in a way or discomfort. So for me, I think the important element about this work is it's about looking at things from different kind of cultural perspectives and scales, but also looking at kind of environmental violence on different scales, because yeah, it's basically it's not a one scalar kind of contamination. There's many different kind of layers. So yes, I'll run through like a series of these photographs. Um, yeah, so I think this work kind of it channeled me into, I mean, because before I started this work, I was looking at the microscopic scale in many different ways. But for example, this one is about pollution and contamination. But I think this work, after I completed this work in 2019, it really like catapulted kind of the studio to go back into the molecular, go back into like small scales as inspirations of like infinitesimal architecture. So like architecture on a scale that we don't see at all, very, very, very small scale kind of landscapes in different worlds. So I started to collect samples from different kind of areas, different kind of very specific areas around London, around my travels. But by looking at this different scale, I started to think about what I categorize like it went back to playing on my mental ecology. I started to think really like, what is the environment? The environment has so many different kind of details and layers and landscapes on the microscopic kind of these microscopic kind of layers, and these are actually like homes for other microorganisms. So I don't know, for like a month or so, I was tiptoeing around the studio, around everywhere, trying not to kind of disrupt these landscapes. But then as I'm evolving, also knowing that there's like a recycling process again in the life and in the death and kind of the rebirth of these landscapes. But from a practical sense, this is kind of different photographs of different samples that I've just been collecting and looking at on a microscopic level to get inspiration about the environment, get information about the unseen environment that my eyes cannot see. So this collection of work is called infinitesimal architecture. So I will speed along to the mineral. I think every form of like matter has some type of like energy in it. It has some type of like presence and energy inside of it. And I think this series of works, like I was really looking at how working with different kind of medicinal artifacts or medicinal kind of extracts and material science, I was thinking of how I can like again go back to the beginning and like create something that would respond. I was tired of making things that were stagnant, and I started to think like, how can things be responsive to the environment? So I started to make um different types of materials that will respond to the environment in different ways. I started to use cellulose, different plant kind of skin extracts that would then respond to the temperature in the rooms. They will respond to the different humidity. And actually, because the cellulose is from the plant skin, I found that the materials would start to, when you change the temperature, the materials will start to curl up on themselves, kind of very similar to how leaves do when they dry. So I started to basically make different artifacts, but also make different series of the material. And I would add different kind of soils, different kind of different kind of medicinal extracts, but also kind of pigments, stones, mica, silica. I was just adding these different kind of natural these natural kind of elements to the cellulose to see what the response would be based on the tension in the material. So as you see, some of the tension here, like the material is trying to roll up on itself. The ones where I've added more soil and cacao, they're a little bit more flat, but they're thicker. So this was like a series of like different experiments that we started creating basically in the studio. And it started off as just experimentation, just trying to again like contemplate and observe the different changes and see what happens when we put the different materials in different environments. How fast would it take for them to decay? How fast would it take for them to transform? So after we made like a series of these materials, I started to think like what would happen, if actually like actually, to be honest, it started like this. Like there's a Chinese philosophy that says if you have anxiety and you cannot sleep very well, you can take your shoes off and you can just walk on the bare soil on the ground for a few minutes, maybe 10 or 15 minutes, and the grounding of the soil will completely calm down your nerves, or it will completely kind of sedate or relax you if you have anxiety or trouble sleeping. So after I had read that kind of information, like I really started to think about how the shoe basically kind of, I mean, it serves many functions, but in a way, like the shoe, in a way, is a disconnect from the grounding of like walking barefoot. So I started to think, what would happen if the shoe, in a sense, could actually be like a form of soil, not the exact soil, but if it could have medicinal extracts in it, if it could somehow, if the material got wet, it would sometimes dissolve. So is there a way that the material could like dissolve medicine or dissolve like soils in someone's foot when they were walking, kind of? So anyway, that whole kind of ideology turned into like a series of footwear that we started to sew the material into like different types of footwear that would then completely decay over time as they would use it, but also would would release kind of medicinal extracts in the skin as the user or as the person would kind of walk on it. And that was a total fail. It wasn't successful in the sense of like a product. And I don't think the product wasn't, it wasn't meant to be like a commercial kind of product. I think like from the prototypes that were made, like the idea very quickly turned into actually like producing a shoe for a user to wear in that sense is irrelevant to kind of the real kind of conceptual framework we wanted to focus on, which is again ephemerality, entropy, and adaptation. So now the work has just kind of formalized into these artifacts that are footwear artifacts that completely, they're like feedback sensors for different environmental like changes, fluctuations in temperature and weather. So now we've had the shoes for about 4 years and we won't sell them to any museums or anything like that. I mean, they've been asked, but yeah, we won't sell them because we just want to constantly kind of document the change of the shoe over the time and kind of just watch it completely decay based on the different kind of environmental elements. So these are like just patterns of how we started to cut them into shapes and forms, and then we started to work on the sole, adding different clays and things like this to kind of give that very firm like soil, but the firm grounding, but also to again implant it with these medicinal extracts that were released. And these were some of the final kind of iterations of the collection. So this one, I mean, as you can see, like this was completely black. in the beginning, but because there was iron oxide inside inside the powder of it was inside the mixture, the shoe is now starting to transform. Obviously some water has gotten in the shoe. And if I can zoom in, like you can see cracks here and here and here, like the shoe is basically breaking on itself each year. And yeah, in the winter time, it kind of cracks on itself, but then in the summertime, you can actually see it crying or like sweating. It starts to produce like moisture just from the heat. So yes, here are some other examples of the collection. So I will just briefly kind of go through um these works. I started to think about again like organisms, and again constantly being constantly going back and forth and researching like just different symbology, different motifs and patterns, and different organisms have always kind of been an inspiration to the studio. And that goes back to like biophilia. How can somehow, how can design kind of mimic, not like biomimicry, but like how can it mimic the different kind of like evolutionary patterns and natural organisms, and not in a sense to like I say mimic them, but I think more so be in like amazement, more kind of symbolic kind of motifs and symbolic inspirations from these different organisms has been something that I've really been, yeah, completely possessed by over the last basically decade. So I think for me, the important thing, I started there, but the important thing once I got into the research was actually to again go back to death. So I started to not just look at specific kind of organisms and their motifs and their patterns, as you can see with these different moths and butterflies, but I started to then really actually be inspired by death and extinct organisms. So endangered and extinct organisms became like, it became like a way to also connect with my culture in the sense that we believe that even the dead still has an ancestral voice. It still has a voice and a connection with the living. So all of these extinct and kind of endangered organisms, I wanted to somehow bridge the gap and use their beauty in a way, keep it alive, by having some type of communication, having some type of relationship to them, even though they are no longer or on the verge of kind of no longer being here on earth. So what I started to do is I started to look at their patterns and like try and recreate their patterns in a way, but as a reinterpretation. So not taking the exact pattern, but reinterpreting these motifs as kind of like consecration objects. So I started to look at different tensile skins, and that goes back to these imageries. Of like basically stretched skin, these sacred kind of motifs and sacred kind of artifacts that are highly embedded in the Native American culture. I started to kind of mix that also in with my own kind of cultural heritage. So again, looking at these different skins and motifs, I wanted to create artifacts of consecration for um extinct and endangered organisms. So some of these are hand knitted, and some of these are like painted. So the process of like art creation, again, it was an experiment, constantly experimenting with different types of mediums to kind of invoke the presence of these deceased or on the verge of being deceased organisms. So this is a collection of hand painted, and from there, I thought like, okay, like I started to think about scale, and I think this is kind of where like the architectural mind maybe clicked on in this period of like kind of the design work. I started to think like, how can, these organisms that are no longer with us, how can they be reborn in like a different process that allowed them to have like basically, or allowed like the concept of them and the consecration of them, how could it like be done on a larger scale that gave the concept a larger voice? So I started to then translate these hand painted and hand knitted knits into an industrial process. And through that industrial process, the organisms like motifs were then like coded into like an algorithm. And then that algorithm is then used to like basically reproduce the fabrics on a larger scale. So for me, I think them at one point, this was kind of the final outcome of these like kind of precious artifacts that again I wanted to preserve. Um, but once it got to this scale, I was like, but actually like preservation is not something that I want to do. Like I want the architecture and I want the organisms symbolically to go back into the environment to then like decompose and transform. So the process kind of again went from looking at the organisms, being in nature a lot, finding different kind of being inspired by different light patterns in the forest and how it kind of penetrates the forest to then like making these different kind of ecosystems of organisms. So I started with components, and then those components were then put together, and through kind of the symbolic arrangement of how the components are put together, you get like different stories of how the organisms were in connection together, and will work together in their environment. So two more slides, two more projects, and then I'll close. Um, this process then evolved into again creating different sacred spaces. This is the work at Palais Tokyo, where again, being very much so inspired by soil, I wanted kind of the audience, the human, to connect with soil in the like in a museum context, you know. So No Soil Temple was actually inspired by the Amazonian soil, this deep red kind of iron soil in the forest. And I was constantly looking at different kind of like plant skins or plant flowers and things like this to basically inspire the shape of all of the tensiles. So sometimes I'm using like organisms like animals, and sometimes I'm also using like plants for inspiration. But I think a key point to kind of address for me is that showing the work in a museum like this or any type of biennale or any type of kind of gallery space is not the end result of the work. I think it's very important for me to say that once the work is produced in this format, I think it has a pedagogy. It has like it has a teaching kind of element or a learning kind of element inside of the museum, and people can experience it in that way. But the end result of these works, they go back to the Amazon and they're meant to basically be taken over completely by the environment. So having like plants, different snakes living inside, different kind of birds' nests and things like this, different plants basically taking over, different climbers taking the whole structure over is like the final kind of outcome, you know? So I think it's very important. I'm just throwing this out there. I think that if any of you want to work in a museum context, just really you can really push to kind of do something that's outside of the box. I think like I'm saying this because like I think it's a special project. It's the first temple that was made and is now installed in the Amazon, where like I really had to push curators and push museum directors to kind of really take on this idea of decay. It was almost like a fight, in the sense of, this thing is not meant to be like collected in the museum in this form. it's meant to actually go back. So I'm just throwing this in as a side note. No matter what you do, really try and like stand strong on whatever your conceptual kind of morals are and your philosophy is for your work. Because I think even though it took a while to kind of get this shown, I think it's worth the wait, because there will always be a home for your ideas when you find out what's really important, for you in that way. So yeah, there's soil all in all of the pockets of these different skins, and again, they will become home for different organisms. So this is the inside, and this is kind of the experience. There's the sound work that also goes along with the work, that people can again can experience. And when it's installed in the forest, it's in collaboration with Amakaba. So there's different kind of like healing ceremonies and different kind of rituals that are done inside on the full moon, the new moon and solstice and equinox as well. So for me, it's like a meeting point for the human and the non-human to kind of come together in observation. So these were some soil kind of baths and burials that were done inside the temple by different ones that would visit. I won't go through this one for time, but this is kind of another project um where I was looking at basically different kind of medicinal plants. And I really we wanted to create basically an apparatus that basically was like a womb-like structure for the unseen. So the main kind of like point of this work was not what you see kind of in this lecture or what you see like on the screen right now. Basically, the most important part you can't experience because it was smell. You know, this was a temple called Aikun, and basically it was completely covered in medicinal plants that with my collaborator, she was looking at more so kind of plants for menstruation, womb health, and birthing, for women's health. And then on my end, I was looking at more like kind of aromatherapy, for like mental health and things like this. So we basically blended those two smells and impregnated the temple with many different herbs so that when the viewer actually experienced the temple, they will be overcome with all of these different smells. The structure of the temple was actually inspired by a fire ant in the Amazon. Um, I was lucky enough to, well, yeah, I was lucky enough to again work with another scientist at Columbia, another place that I'm teaching at, and we basically looked at the back of the neck cells on this ant, the back of the neck skin, not the cells, sorry, on this ant, and then also like the different formations of its anatomy to come up with the form. So again, that goes back to um, biophilia, just looking at and dynamism, looking at how kind of nature and different scales, microscopic scales, how basically systems matter, how it all works, and basically symbolically being inspired by that. So this is some of the design. And this was the final kind of outcome. It was for the Back to Earth exhibition. And you just have all of these, you know, um, yeah, medicinal kind of herbs that people could smell. And then after the exhibition, this one will also go back to, this one has already gone back to the Amazon forest, but hasn't been installed yet. We're still looking for the best place for it. But again, it will kind of be a place where people can gather medicinal herbs, like a communal kind of area for people to dry like medicinal herbs and things like this, while still on the sides allowing like the plants to completely kind of take it over. So these are some more images. So I will close and kind of open it up to a conversation and have some feedback from you all. But I think the main takeaway here is that I really love the unseen. I love decay, um, death and transformation. And I think these are all kind of architectural and art inspirations that are sometimes overlooked, because mold, we run away from mold, or maintaining kind of the pristine garden and making sure that everything is cut in these different shapes and things like this. I think sometimes, like, over maintaining um nature in a way doesn't allow for the voice of it to be heard in its fullest extent, or just maybe a different tone of that voice is not heard because it's maintained so much. So for me, again, the process starts from here, and then it goes to like plants, and then ideally, like, in 2 or 3 years, all of the temples will end up looking like this. So I'm finished. Thank you so much for your.
Thank you so much, Yussef. I think you can see us somehow and maybe hear us. I don't know if I stand here, if it's any better. I guess you can also see me here.
Yes, I can see you, and I can see the group as well.
Perfect. Yeah, yeah. And I think there's also some folks online. But like I said, thank you so. Whoa. Sorry. Thank you so much for that. I know that some folks might have to disappear, but I think if you still have time, Yusuf, maybe we can take 5 or 10 minutes and just see if anyone has some questions. Um, Maybe I'll start with a question, although you kind of spoke to it in a way, but it's sort of two sides of the same coin. And it has to do with this idea of the sacred, which you talked about, and also, you've done a series of installations in sort of very prestigious institutions of, let's say, the world of art and design, where you actually called those projects temples. And so the question in a way is, if you could share any other maybe words of advice or thoughts about how we can engage with this topic or idea, because I think especially in the world of architecture, which is so focused on the delivery of sort of physical material objects, there's this emphasis on matter when so many indigenous traditions never decouple matter from spirit. And somehow we almost lack a kind of ontology for talking about um, these other dimensions of sort of physical architectures, and maybe the sacred is part of it. So yeah, I guess that was maybe one part, and the flip part of it has to do with also an environment. So I noticed that you couple the word architecture with environment as kind of environmental architecture sometimes, and uh, I know that you're not here today, but I believe that if we speak it into existence, you will be here one day. I think it would be wonderful to actually have you here when we can arrange it and pull it off properly. But this is a building, a magnificent one, but one which is very much separate from the environment. We're an air-conditioned building, we're interiorized, we have somehow windows, but we're not a forest. We're not a field or a prairie. And so I guess the question in a way of that part is, how can we, in terms of pedagogy and education of architecture, how can we, in the context of education, engage with this, let's say, dialogue with nature aspect, if we're learning architecture within boxes that are separate from the environment? So yeah, it's like any other thoughts you have maybe on that, speaking to kind of maybe folks who also are in a process of their own education.
Yes, I think yes, I think that it's tricky because I think me, I'm also teaching, but I would say that I think it's an ideology that has to first I think we should deconstruct exactly what an architect is, because I feel like once we kind of deconstruct once we deconstruct what the architect is, I think it actually, or not even deconstruct, once we question what the architect is in a way, we kind of open it up to be so much more than maybe what we thought it was, you know? And I think that's one thing that me and my students do quite a bit is that we actually, yeah, we question like who exactly it is that we are and what it is that we're trying to do. So I think if that within like the pedagogical construct, you know, of like university and school, I think if we use the university and school to deconstruct, you know, in a way, somehow the walls in which you deconstruct in don't exist in that sense. Bear with me on that. Like basically, it's like I think that school and being in the actual school is one kind of element, but I think it's actually what you do when you leave the school, you know, or when you're outside of the school that is really interesting. So that is toward your second question. I don't know if I've kind of answered that, but that is kind of how I feel about that. And I guess the first question would be, as far as the temples are concerned, I think I kind of mentioned earlier, like I really don't like I'm using the kind of terminology of temple. And I know it's a loaded word, you know, and it's connected to many different types of many different types of spiritual practices. But for me, the temple is an observation space. You know, it's a space to kind of contemplate and slow down and just like observe. So I think for me, it does connect to many different cultures and many different religions, but I'm not so much interested in that kind of like ritual and practice, or the temple is not made to be in connection to those practices, you know. It kind of sits on its own. A lot of times I call the temples um kind of living architectural entities, in the sense that they are entities on their own, you know, again kind of trying to remove my own control from the situation, you know, and allow it to transform. I think that they have a presence and they have a living kind of life of their own, you know. The temple will attract certain birds to fly over it and poop on it, and on that bird poop there's some seeds, and then the seeds somehow grow some flowers on it, and then something, a lizard comes and eats it, and that, like, I feel like it has its own thing, you know, and that kind of just sits yes, in its own kind of area. So as much as I'm inspired by many different belief systems, I try not to connect it to any specific ones.
Perfect.
I don't know if that even answered
It's great.
the first question.
Any other questions? Any questions from the audience? Yeah, Rohan. Like, yeah, just come close and shout so we can hear you.
Hi, thanks for your presentation. Amazing projects. But me and DK, like, we kind of exchange a look because there's a lot of similarities between what I'm working on now and then, like, your work. I'm working on DK material design and research. And like, I was kind of like, because I have this challenge now, and in the comments, like, yeah, what my work was this, like, uh, kind of harsh and sweet. Like, you talked about like deconstructing mindsets kind of in school and in, like, universities. But like getting those comments in this context, kind of like, it's kind of surprising too, especially like in architecture, kind of. And then most of them are like these type of work is kind of like statement works in a way. You're trying to showcase your ideas as a person or as a designer, right? And then it doesn't have any values as long as it doesn't contribute anything to science or knowledge, right? They're like, these are fine as statement pieces, but we don't see the value of it in like science. So because we talked about like the intersection of design, arts, and like science in the beginning or in architecture. So how would you? I mean, I don't know if like my question is like I don't know if you experienced such a challenge in your process of like reaching here, or what is your how would you approach this challenge? Because I often find myself convincing the other ones about the idea rather than doing my work, right? I feel like my job is just convincing the other ones, not just doing my work. That's the challenge I have. I don't know. I want to know your opinion about this. Thank you.
Yeah, I think it's yeah, I think it's a great kind of question, you know. I think you should really get used to convincing people of your ideas. Like you got to get used to that. You got to really embrace it, you know? And that goes back to kind of even my first answer is like that is also part of, let's say, a design or architect, artist, or whoever, you know. I think we are the dreamers and the ones that have, you know, so many different ideas. So I think convincing people of the idea is very much so a part of like the job. Um, and then for the first part of your question is yeah, I think I just think that I think when you embrace like the funness, you know, it's a challenge at first, you know, not having someone be able to understand um you know, your ideas and not being able to kind of understand the, you know, maybe how you want to materialize something, you know. But I think there's like a certain joy in like the process of helping people to understand your vision, you know. And so I think the more that you embrace that, I think you know, the easier it becomes. It wasn't easy for me in the beginning, you know, but I think the more that I just kind of, you know, stay true to kind of the kind of the conviction of like different things that I've been working on, like I think it builds character, you know, and it builds a certain strength that will last you, and it's something that you can apply to any kind of work that you do, you know. Yes.
Yussef, thank you for your talk. I have a question that came up as you were talking, which is that the models that you discussed, for example, that a bird poops and the poop contains seeds, the seeds grow, right? So these are models of entropy in nature, and you are putting things in nature. You made a framework that's going to go in nature. So the first question is whether we and things that we make are nature, or are they not nature? And the second question is, if they are nature, if we are a part of that entropy, at what point, like, how do we gauge when we disrupt the entropy? Is it a matter of scale? Is it a matter of degree? How do we know that the framework that you're putting out in nature is disrupting the cycle, or is becoming a part of the cycle? Thank you.
Yes, thank you so much. I think the first question is super loaded, and I don't think we have the time to go into the first one. Because the nature, not nature, are humans nature, are they not human nature? Like that one is I mean, that is a multi-layered one, you know? But just in a nutshell, I don't have the answer to that because I think nature is a word, a terminology that I don't fully understand yet, you know, fully. And that's the honest truth. I don't really understand what is nature, what is not nature yet. So I'll just be flat out. But for me, I think that we are all in a constant feedback loop with our environment, you know, and that is a system maybe that we can say is nature. Maybe not because it's too loaded. But I think the material palette of the actual temples are a lot of it is they're all natural fibers. So cotton based, there's like linen, there's different types of even cellulose-based fibers that's stronger than steel even, but all plant-based, based on the way the yarn chemistry. So all of it, the fabrics over time, microorganisms will eat it and they will also disappear. I don't know how long that will take, but the natural kind of cycle of the cotton, it will decay, and when the root, my structurally, what I'm thinking, what I hypothesize is the root structures that embed themselves onto the cotton will actually hold it up in different ways. But I haven't lived long enough yet to see this one, this actually happened. Maybe it will not. So yes, to your question, I feel like when it becomes toxic, I feel like it's a retraction of the different kind of things that we like. I don't think that it should become like, for instance, the first work in Oguni land, those oil spills are toxic, they're killing like a lot, on different scales. So I feel like just in a nutshell, to be brief, because I feel like we could really communicate about this is I just think that, you know, it should not be toxic, and it should I think very much so when the thing about putting something in the forest, for instance, the Amazon forest, because that's the environment that they're in now, is that you'll see the feedback. You'll see if organisms engage with it. Like they will tell you if it's something that they enjoy, if it's something that they'll thrive on, or if it's something that they could disregard and care less. If you put a plastic container in the middle of the Amazon forest, I mean, the container is going to sit there and plants are going to grow over it. That's going to happen, but that plastic container is still going to sit there. Whereas I think the temples in itself, they're made out of like wood and like the cotton, all of that stuff transforms. The process of it transforms. So I think I'm at a state now where I'm still learning whether I'm either being destructive or whether I'm amplifying. And I'll be the first to admit that, I don't have the answer of whether I am, being a saint, because I don't, I'm not, that's not the aim, but yeah, as of now, it seems like the plants really like the cotton, and it seems like the birds really like to poop on it, and it seems like, plants kind of grow on that. So it seems like it's okay for now.
Question or,
I did.
and then
Go
we'll go to
ahead.
you, and then we'll go to you after.
Hi, Yussef. Thank you so much for your talk. There's so many questions that are ideas coming up. But this idea of like textile and architecture is something that I'm interested in. And I know that you're taught like the shoes that you were showing sort of like adapted to the climate, to the moisture, depending on like what was happening around the moon. So I feel like as an architecture student, I want to incorporate this idea of like textiles and something that's like naturally found. So like, how can I design something that's breathable, that's um, coming from nature, um, healthy, an environment for other species? How can I design something that can also be like structurally sound and like adaptive to that? Like, what advice or approach would you use to move along with this like topic?
For sure. That's a great question. Yeah, that's a super great question. I think it's a question that even a lot of my students also, I mean, some of them experiment in totally different ways, with the same kind of question in that sense, in the sense of like, okay, um, they totally like get what I'm doing, and they like it and things like this is interesting. But then what if I want to build something, in a way where it actually, it can last, or it can be structurally sound in a sense, and still kind of follow the same philosophy as using different kind of materials, that are natural. And I think I'm not a kind of I'm a student kind of to the environment. And what I've learned is that basically, like, what makes like materials in, let's say, nature very structurally sound is layering, like a lot of layering, crisscrossing, weaving, layering, like the more layers that you have structurally, the more solid something becomes. So I would say, okay, that's one thing. I would say try and research there's a book called Animal Architecture that I actually like really love. I forgot who it's by, but it's a text. Maybe I can forward it after, but it has all of these different kind of animal architectures and all of the processes of how they structurally kind of make things sound. So I think maybe doing some research on that if you want, but also I think uh school, being at Penn State or whatever kind of university that you're at, I think it demands collaboration. It demands multidisciplinary kind of relationships and conversations to happen. So shoot over to the engineering department, the mechanical engineering department, maybe sit with somebody that's studying in there also, and maybe you can gain some kind of inspiration to the way that they are studying materials, and then from there you can apply it to the different kind of designs, or maybe using materials that you want to that are natural to create new structures. But I think experimentation is key. You got to make mistakes. You got to figure out you got to experiment and make different kind of artifacts and mistakes, and then through that feedback loop of trial and error, I think you can come up with different types of solutions. But on a practical level, you can also look at different African architecture, different orient, like there's so many different bamboo, there's clay, there's like so many different materials that have already been researched culturally that have very strong structural capacity, like for instance, there's different mosque and different there's a mosque in Mali, I believe. I forgot the name of it. Where, yes. Did somebody say something?
Yeah, Jenny, yeah.
Right. So the beautiful thing about that mosque is that it's all clay, but it cracks. And when it cracks, you have all of the community putting clay to bring it back together. So there is a maintenance in it, but it's a community kind of element, So there's so many different kind of ways that maybe if you want to design something that's structurally sound, maybe there's certain, you know, community maintaining processes that you can embed in the designs, or even like in Shintoism and like, Shinto shrines and things, they're rebuilt every 5 years, from, in Japan, out of the same kind of wood in different ways, like recycle, like there's so many kind of elements in that way that I think you can research to use natural materials, but at the same time, having something that is structurally sound.
Thank you.
You still want to ask your question? Yeah. Yeah, take advantage, your last chance. So, Yussef, we have one last question for you. I know it's super late for you in Lagos, but
Okay.
last question and then we'll let you work.
It kind of ties into the last question, but I was just I agree with the philosophy completely of like constant change and growth through time. And I was curious how designs like that, or you kind of mentioned like the Shinto shrine that's like rebuilt every years. Have you done designs that have been have been put into like a human environment, and how has reaction been from that? Like, have people cooperated with that, like constant change, or has there been like a rejection?
Yeah, I think, I mean, as far as the museums and things like this, it's it's actually, I think I think with like kind of the institutions and stuff, I will say this. Okay. I guess what okay, it is being recorded. Okay, so I'll say
Just don't mention any institutions by name.
right, right. But no, I was basically gonna say that honestly, like once you have one show, honestly, in a museum, I know it sounds crazy. Once you have one show, all the other ones somehow like they want to support you and they're like, let's do something, you know? So I think like now I don't have to fight as much, you know. The studio also like there's different projects that are lined up, but I think that yeah, I've had, for instance, in Hong Kong just last year. The show is actually still up. It ends in March, but we actually did a temple called Mika Temple, and basically the whole temple is like surrounded by plants. Plants are embedded in the temple, so they opted for. They were like, okay, you want to do something outside, let's do it outside, or you know, so they put it right in the front of their museum, and then after it's going to go to a botanical garden. It's not going to make it back to the Amazon. It's going to go to a botanical garden in Hong Kong, you know, and kind of be able to decay over like years. We're still kind of trying to agree on the amount of years, but I mean, that's other kind of layers of admin where you have to kind of, you know, but so that is a great thing, you know, because it connects to the philosophy in that way. And to answer your question, I really think that you know, children have really been the best kind of feedback loop for me as far as whether the structures are. I think you asked how people react to them. I think children really are really honest, you know, and they really give a sense of kind of perspective and scale in relation to like future generations. And I've run some workshops at different museums with like students, like all different ages, you know, and I just, you know, they're brutally honest. Some say, you know, like, what is the point of this, you know, or some say like, you know, how you know, or some like love it, you know, some like ask a lot of questions. So I really think that for me it's really enriching to kind of hear all of those perspectives and also to get their ideas. But when I talk to them, I always do a workshop where they design their own kind of structures and things like this. And then like when they ask me the questions, maybe like, you know, some of the more like super honest and direct ones, by designing their own structures, they start to really get into it. And they start to really be like, oh, then I can do this with mine, and then mine can actually be in the canopy or something like, you know. So I think for me, people have really responded to it in really, really many different ways, you know. And I think that's the beautiful thing about art, that it's open to perspective and it allows for like diverse interpretation.
Yussef, on that note, I want to say thank you again so much for joining us through this wormhole and for staying up super late in Lagos. I look forward to the future when you'll be here in Happy Valley, and I'll let you hop off now since you're on the big screen. Have a good night, and thank you
Okay.
again from
Thank you guys so much. Yeah. Take care.